we're looking at one of the great novels of all time, Don Quixote. I'm going to throw to Dr. Myers to introduce us to.
This is one of my favorite books. This is one of the most, in my opinion, one of the most purely delightful books in the world. There are books that you read for wisdom. There are books that you read for their insight into human nature. There are books that you might read for emotional highs and lows. Don Quixote, I think, is just a world of delights. It is such a there is something so gaius is the old word for it. There's a sense of revelry and fun and adventure, mixed with very poignant qualities that we can talk about as well. But if you've never encountered Don Quixote before, and if you're watching this before you've read the book, I hope our conversation will spur you on to really spend some time reading this, or listening. There's a very good Audible version as well that really brings the story to life. Before any English novels had been written, the English novel begins, of course, with Defoe and Richardson and Fielding in the 17th century, towards the turn to the 18th century. But already during the period of Shakespeare in Spain, Don Quixote had created this completely new method of storytelling.
This is published now as a novel.
Yeah,
that's how you buy it in a bookshop.
Yeah.
So, but it's not really a novel. Is that what you're suggesting?
Oh no, I'm suggesting it is.
Okay.
I'm suggesting it's right to see this as the beginning of the novel, even though the English novelistic tradition kind of stands outside and alongside it. But it is a book about reading books. It's a book about imagination. It's a satire, and it has that in common with the early English novelistic tradition too, which constantly engages satirically with earlier sources. Maybe if we just start right in chapter 1 and let me make some observations.
I found this so funny, by the way. It's consistently funny.
It is so funny.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's really well paced as well. I think that he manages to. It's not side splitting. It's not over the top. It's just consistent. There's these great lines, and there's built moments where it's so wonderful. It's really fun.
It's play. I was looking for the word for it. It is such a playful
that's what it
book.
Is. It's playful.
It is a joyous experience to read this story. Joyous because of the character of Don Quixote himself, who is living in this parallel universe. He is intoxicated by the books that he's read. He has grown up reading. The technical name for these books is romances, stories of knights and valor and damsels in distress and chivalry and battles against monsters.
And there are a lot of these around, right? They're a common genre in the late medieval, early modern period. I mean, not that they were thinking like this, but we can look back and period.
Yes. So in Renaissance Spain, 16th century Spain, in the period where Cervantes was living, the absolute popular best-selling genre was stories of knights and romance, and it centers on love, romantic love. Don Quixote, we're told on the first page, is this old gentleman who. Can I read the opening lines? Because this is a wonderful story.
It's great.
In a village of La Mancha, the name of which I have no desire to recall, there lived not so long ago one of those gentlemen who always have a lance in the rack, an ancient buckler, a skinny nag, and a greyhound for the chase. He is a country gentleman. His skinny nag becomes important later. Becomes, I guess, a character in the story. He lives with this housekeeper and a niece and a boy who saddles his horse. Don Quixote, we're told, down to the second paragraph, is about 50 years old, but he's skinny and his face is gaunt. Do you know why he's skinny and his face is gaunt? Because he is wasting away reading books. He doesn't even sleep enough. He's so eager. He gets up very early. Look at this, by the way, in the second paragraph. They will try to tell you that his surname was Quijada or Quisada. There is some difference of opinion among those who have written on the subject, but according to the most likely conjectures, we are to understand that it was really Quejana. But all this means very little so far as our story is concerned, providing that in the telling of it, we do not depart one iota from the truth.
That's right.
Now, that's an incredible opening.
Very interesting.
That's one of my favorite, like, an opening paragraph to a story. The book is called Don Quixote. All through the book, he's going to be titled Don Quixote. The narrator begins by saying, well, his name might have been this, it might have been that. Actually, I did some research and it's probably this, but we're going to call him Don Quixote. And he then has the audacity to say, I'm going to tell you his story and not depart one iota from the truth. One of the things that makes this an absolutely wonderful book is the narrator.
Yeah.
The narrator has so much presence in this story. His wry, ironic, he does not see the world the way Don Quixote does, and he has an ironic relationship to the story that he's telling and an ironic relationship to truth. He's claiming that this is a true story. What we'll learn as we go on in the book is that this is actually a story about the problem of truth, the relation between truth and fantasy, the relation between books and reality, the relation between words and things. Let's read on and we'll see what Don Quixote's problem is. You may know then that the aforesaid gentleman, on those occasions when he was at leisure, which was most of the year round, was in the habit of reading books of chivalry with such pleasure and devotion as to lead him almost wholly to forget the life of a hunter and even the administration of his estate. So great was his curiosity and infatuation in this regard, that he even sold many acres of tillable land in order to be able to buy and read the books that he loved, and would carry home with him as many of them as he could obtain. And it goes on to describe these books that he is addicted to. I've got to read on a bit more. 2 more paragraphs down, in short, or maybe 3 more paragraphs. In short, our gentleman became so immersed in his reading that he spent whole nights from sundown to sunup, and his days from dawn to dusk in poring over his books, until finally, from so little sleeping and so much reading, his brain dried up, and he went completely out of his mind. So we begin with a hero who is completely insane. What does his insanity consist of, though? It's a very touching and funny, and I think even ennobling condition. He has read and devoured and loved these stories so much that he's actually come to believe that they're true. Yeah. These stories that he's been reading have become for him a kind of code that he, you know, in The Matrix, for those of you who've seen the movie The Matrix, where you can look at what's in front of you, or you can look at the code and there's this code wrapped around everything. Well, Don Quixote sees everything as part of a romance story. He believes that his withered, emaciated old nag of a horse is Rosinante, a great heroic battle steed. He believes that he himself, this withered, scholarly... I have to show you something. So great is my esteem for this gentleman that I even have a little... I won't say an idol, but a little statue of him on my shelves. Nice. There he is, looking skinny and withered up, walking around with his face in a book. So he, this scholarly country gentleman, believes himself to be a famous legendary knight who has won many battles. His dutiful squire, Sancho Panz, who we can talk some more about in a little bit. Yeah, we should. A wonderful character who sees that his master is completely insane, but also thinks that he might stand to benefit by going along with him. And in a weird kind of loop. Sancho Panza talks himself into going along with everything Don Quixote wants to do, all these incredibly ridiculous adventures, in the hope that he will be rewarded one day with an island that Don Quixote will conquer for him. So Don Quixote is going to ride it on his withered horse, conquer the island, dispel its local inhabitants, and set up Sancho Panza as king and governor of this island. Now, Sancho Panza knows his master is insane from reading too many books, but he also would love to be governor of that island, so he goes along with it. He's stuck in this incredibly funny loop, and he is, in my opinion, the greatest sidekick in literature. Think of all those other stories that have a great sidekick. Sherlock Holmes has Watson. Frodo has Sam. Who are the other great sidekicks? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Batman has Robin.
Batman has Robin.
Yeah. There's so many.
There's so many that I can't think of any more after those three. But the sidekick character owes a lot to Don Quixote, who has the greatest sidekick character in the world, Sancho Panza, who will go with him anywhere and do anything out of this loving, friendly loyalty and this obvious, blatant self-interest.
Yes.
And a hilarious self-interest, because he knows it's all based on fantasy. He knows it's all delusion. So the book is exploring the relation between books and the world, between reality and illusion. And the potential for comedy turns out to be virtually inexhaustible. Once the life that you're living, once everything in your life you filter through this make-believe delusional lens, every situation becomes potential for comedy. I've got to mention one more element of this. Don Quixote believes that he has a great lady, the Lady Dulcinea of Toboso. She is to be his bride. She is a damsel in a tower, and Don Quixote, the knight, is going to win the battles necessary to win the hand of the one he calls my lady Dulcinea of Toboso.
Yes.
When you finally get to meet this snotty-nosed peasant pig farmer's daughter, it's hilarious because of the disjunction between reality and the world that Don Quixote sees. Even seeing her, though, a pig farmer's daughter, he still sees none other than the Lady Dulcinea of Toboso. So the comedy is at a very high pitch, and the novel has an episodic structure where they are out on this unspecified adventure, except it's about winning the hand of the lady, and they just go through one hilarious set of misunderstandings after another.
Yeah. And one of his key aims is to right wrongs. Like, he wants to go out there, and he says in chapter 1, he would go in quest of adventures by way of putting into practice all that he had read in his books.
Yeah.
He would right every manner of wrong, placing himself in situations of the greatest peril, such as would redound to the eternal glory of his name. So he really has been. He's been totally. He's been hoodwinked by these books in some sense into thinking that he too can be this hero. It's also ridiculous, and he. In fact, one of the first encounter where he tries to right a wrong, he gets totally the wrong way around. Not totally the wrong way around, but where he encounters the farmer and the boy in the forest, and he deals with this situation in such a way, like, he's absolutely certain of himself. He deals with the situation, but it's really not clear that the farmer is necessarily in the wrong at the end. Like, you realise that the boy is also, a rascal too. So you see immediately that all of his good intentions, insane intentions, but good intentions, He's absolutely certain that he's doing the right thing, but there's no. It's totally random as to what the outcome will be.
And he causes great harm. He gives people a walloping at times. He always comes off worse himself.
Yeah.
Like most of his adventures lead to situations where you would need to be hospitalized afterwards. But he does cause great harm to persons and property everywhere he goes. But it's not the kind of book in which you are invited to make moral judgments upon our hero. There is something so... And you can see how easily the story could have gone wrong if we start thinking, this is a bad man.
Yeah.
We never think that. We love this hero. And I wonder, yes, he's insane, but think of it this way. These noble stories that set out these high values, the code of chivalry, the sense of courage, the idea that if there's anything wrong in the world, at any cost to yourself, you should thrust yourself into the middle of that situation and put things right.
Yes.
Like, that is such... One way of reading the book would be to say, well, the rest of the world has gone mad.
Yeah.
And Don Quixote looks insane because he actually stands for all the things that are important. He stands for romantic love. He stands for courage. He stands for valor. He stands for justice. And in a topsy-turvy world like ours, you're never going to come out on top if you stand for all those things. If you can't look out for your own interests. If you can't cut your losses and so on, if you can't accept your place in life. So it's a book that I think even experiments with, it's about our perception. It's about the way we see the world. One way of thinking about it, we were talking about Beowulf last week, a book about the world of pagan culture, just as it is passing away and about to be eclipsed by the Christian revelation. In a way, you could look at Don Quixote as a book about the world of medieval feudal life, just at the point at which it is vanishing away. And by the time this old gentleman, Don Quixote, is reading these books, that medieval world only exists now in books. It's already a thing of the past. He brings it back. Yeah.
But it's totally out of place.
Yeah, no longer fits in this world. None of these things, none of the stories are a reliable guide to reading the world anymore.
So even if actually it's quite conceivable that if he had indeed been a true knight and he'd ridden around acting like a true medieval chivalrous knight, people would have responded in a similar fashion.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's just that it's
if you'd been the noblest knight in history and you'd been like through a time machine transplanted into our time, you would be insane.
Yeah, it'd be ridiculous.
And you would misread everything that was going on around you because you would be living by actually a higher code.
Yes.
But a code that in our world is just insane.
Yeah.
And going to cause trouble and get everyone hurt and get yourself wound up in hospital.
So the technique that's used here though is that you have there's no time travel. It's just someone who's gone mad.
Yeah.
And then thinks that he's a knight. But there could have been a time travel scenario, and the result would have been similar.
Yeah. And the way that Don Quixote, we won't go right into this, but this book has influenced many of the great stories in the world. And there are lots of films and novels that explicitly use this technique of having a character whose perception goes completely wrong. There's one that I quite like by an Australian novelist, Peter Carey, called Bliss. And the book begins with this guy thinking he's died.
Oh, yeah.
He hasn't died. He gets up again, but he thinks he's died and gone to hell. He then goes home to his family, and everything that happens for the rest of the book, his employer, his wife, his kids, he's just there in a daze thinking he's in hell being punished, and everything matches. So it's quite funny and shocking at times to realize, if you switch your perception, you can find a lot of evidence that will match.
Yeah.
And in films, there are many comedy films that involve an element of time travel.
Yeah.
I think there's a recent German one where the Führer comes back to 2018 or 2019 and is walking around in Berlin. That is Don Quixote adapted, having a character who belongs to another time and place, whose moral code is, think of how dangerous and toxic Hitler's moral code was. You transplant him to Berlin in 2019, and it's hilarious.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is a very insignificant example. The techniques there. We watched Toy Story with the kids the other day, the Toy Story 1, and Buzz Lightyear actually thinks he's a spaceman for the first half of the movie.
Exactly. That is based on Don Quixote.
Yeah.
Indirectly, but that's where that idea comes from. Yeah. Exactly. And it works. It produces so much comedy,
really funny,
and there's so many fights and things where all the evidence points to the fact that he's right.
Yeah. Come in, Space Command. Come in. Why don't they answer?
that is absolutely a Don Quixote scenario.
Yeah, yeah.
A great way of making a funny story. Can we talk about?
Well, I was going to say Sancho. We're going to talk about Sancho. Yeah. There's a great chapter. Chapter 10 is the first point, I think, where you have, well, at least in our reading. So Sancho is I think he's a farmer from like a peasant farmer from nearby, isn't he? He has a farm nearby. He agrees to go with Don Quixote. I don't believe in the reading we find out exactly how that occurs. I think it's passed over. But Sancho.
It's because Don Quixote invites him to be his squire.
So,
why? Because he's read in books. Well, look, I'm a knight errant now.
I must have a squire.
Everyone needs a squire. Yeah. Would you like to perform that role?
So he agrees to play the role. And he leaves his wife and his children to go on this adventure with this insane person who thinks he's a knight. And so I guess before we close in a few minutes, the chapter 10 is where there is the title of the chapter is Of the Pleasing Conversation That Took Place Between Don Quixote and Sancho Panz, his squire. And you see this dynamic between so Sancho is not insane. He's gullible, but he's quite rational as well. So he calls into question a lot of Don Quixote's conclusions and reasoning. There's just to start us off. There's this great one where Don Quixote is absolutely. I make a vow to the Creator of all things, and to the four holy Gospels in all their fullness of meaning, that I will lead from now on the life that the great Marquis of Mantua did after he had sworn to avenge the death of his nephew Baldwin, not to eat bread off a tablecloth, not to embrace his wife, and other things which, although I am unable to recall them, we will look upon as understood. All this until I have wreaked an utter vengeance upon the one who has perpetrated such an outrage upon me. And then Sancho says, but let me remind your grace that if the knight fulfills that which was commanded of him by going to present himself before my lady Dulcinea del Toboso, then he will have paid his debt to you and merits no further punishment at your hands, unless it be for some other fresh offence. Like there's this very reasonable objection to the valor and the valorous fury of Don Quixote.
I love the vow, by the way, to vow something before the Creator and the four holy Gospels, but not to actually remember the content of the. Hilarious.
But this sets up the dynamic, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The friendship, if I can call it that, it's not a conventional friendship because one is the Lord and one is the squire. But the relationship that develops between these two, to me, is the real, what gives the book its most characteristic charm, and its greatest appeal for me lies in these scenes where the two of them converse together. And you look at how skillful Sancho Panza is at, as it were, acclimatizing himself to Don Quixote's perception and reasoning with him, not in a way that is absolutely rational, but rational within.
Yes. Within the world of Don Quixote.
It'd be like trying to. It'd be like reasoning with someone who believes in a flat Earth, but finding a flat Earth type premise that will get the desired result. And Don Quixote, one of his endearing qualities is his receptiveness.
Yes.
You have spoken very well and to the point, said Don Quixote, and so I annul the vow I have just made, etc. This momentous and astounding vow that is going to shape the rest of my life. And Sancho Panza poses one fairly mild, rational objection. Good point. I annul the vow. Don Quixote has such a mobile, nimble mind. He is not set in his ways. He's got a wonderful receptivity to the world around him, especially to Sancho Panza, which is strange given that even Sancho Panza, he never sees him for what he is. He sees him as a squire on this mission, not as someone from a neighboring farm.
Yeah, that's right.
But that mix is so wonderful between someone whose view of everything is completely delusional, and yet who is so easily persuaded, so mentally agile, so adaptable to a good argument, so adaptable to the circumstance as well. We might think we're going on an adventure to do this, but because what a knight errant does is wander around and have adventures, anything else that happens along the way will command my full attention.
Yes.
These are such admirable qualities. Do you see what I mean? Can I point to another exchange in this conversation in chapter 10? This is on the first page of chapter 10, where they are taking shelter for the night. "It strikes me, sir," said the squire as he reached his master's side, "that it would be better for us to take refuge in some church. For in view of the way you have treated that one with whom you are fighting, it would be small wonder if they did not lay the matter before the Holy Brotherhood and have us arrested. And, faith, if they do that, we shall have to sweat a plenty before we come out of jail." "Be quiet," said Don Quixote. "And where have you ever seen or read of a knight being brought to justice, no matter how many homicides he might have committed? Where have you ever seen or read of?" His code is, Sancho Panz is like, in the real world, if you just go around killing people, you'll get thrown in jail. I don't remember a single book in which that happened, so it doesn't worry me. Anyway, do you have another example from this conversation?
No, there's a good one where they're talking about food. That he's saying that he's hungry, and Sancho says, "I have here an onion, a little cheese, and a few crusts of bread, but they are not victuals fit for a valiant knight like your grace." "How little you know about it," replied Don Quixote. "I would inform you, Sancho, that it is a point of honour with knights errant to go for a month at a time without eating, and when they do eat, it is whatever may be at hand." And he says that he talks about it for quite a while. "Pardon me, your grace," said Sancho, "it seems that, as I have told you, I do not know how to read or write. I'm consequently not familiar with the rules of nightly calling. Hereafter I'll stuff my saddlebags with all manner of dried fruit for your grace." Because he talks about how he can just get by on very little and on rustic foods and basic things. So he's like, but that's fine. I'll put dried fruit, and I'll have a stock of fowls. He says, "I'll have for myself a stock of fowls and much more substantial fare." I am not saying, Sancho, that it is incumbent upon knights errant to eat only those fruits of which you speak. What I am saying is that their ordinary sustenance should consist of fruit and a few herbs, and so on. So anyway, it's just very funny how that.
Oh, it's a wonderful meeting of minds, isn't it?
It's very good.
Sancho, as always, finding an angle. He's able to identify the levers that will. So his is pure self-interest. There's only enough food for one, so I'm going to make a knight-errant type argument about why I should get it. And then Don Quixote, so devoted to his code, will then, with this scholarly authority, talking to someone who's illiterate as well, just weigh in and correct him in order to.
That's right.
Naked, they're both hungry. Naked self-interest on both parts, but a wonderful meeting of minds and a wonderful. It's so funny, but it's also such a genuine, realistic kind of. Realistic's the wrong word, but the way each from their own vantage point of
Yes.
pure self-interest is able to negotiate this position.
Yeah.
And the way Don Quixote, as inflexibly committed as he seems to these codes that he's learned in books, when it comes to the essentials, like what we're going to eat, he shows again mental agility,
Yeah,
and
right.
you can see him combing through books in his mind and making stuff up and suppressing some things that don't match this.
Yes.
It's partly I think a comedy about the relationship between books and life. I mean, I know we mentioned this before, but if you think of medieval scholarship, where, let's say, even the natural sciences, for example, how did you learn about animal species if you're a medieval biologist? You studied the books of Aristotle, who had categorized the species and had identified their various characteristics and so on. You observed the world through the lens always of written authorities. How do you relate to God and your neighbor and the prince and society if you're a medieval Christian? Through the lens of the Bible. The extent to which reality is mediated to us through books, even today, is enormous. No one is just accessing reality naturally, as it were. And it's I think by the way Cervantes turns that into comedy, crystallizing it in one person who completely sees the world through the lens of books, not in a way that it's all dictated for him. As you see about the food, he's able to negotiate as necessary.
Yes.
Much the way religious people will start negotiating about their texts when the occasion demands.
Yes. Yes.
But I find the book, as well as the sheer comedy, as well as the sheer playfulness, as well as the sheer joy of putting these two characters together in a room and listening to them talk, I find it as well quite a profound and thought-provoking investigation of the extent to which the world that we live in, the world that we inhabit, is mediated to us through through books.
Yeah, it's great. It's great fun. It's been good to talk about it. Thanks.